Bonjour tout le monde et bienvenue à cette rencontre.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this meeting that I have the pleasure of calling to order now. Welcome to meeting number 7 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security, pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on September 18th. The committee is meeting concerning its study on Canada-United States border management. Today's meeting, as is the case of all meetings, is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. And in order to ensure the smooth running of the meeting, of course, I would like to invite the witnesses and members to follow the directives that have been shared. At this stage, I would like to welcome our witnesses for the first hour. We have 2 important witnesses that we wish to thank, of course, in advance for their important contribution to the committee's deliberations. The first being Mr. Thomas Boyle, who is Chief Executive Officer of the Buffalo and Fort Erie Public Bridge Authority, and the second being Mr. Kenneth Biggar, who is on the screen, Chief Executive Officer of the Niagara Falls Bridge Commission. Gentlemen, witnesses, you are welcome, and we will begin with Mr. Boyle and follow with Mr. Biggar. Each of you has 5 minutes for your comments. Over to you, Mr. Biggar.
Good morning, and thank you for this opportunity to testify as part of your study on the management of the U.S.-Canadian border. The organization I represent is the Niagara Falls Bridge Commission, which is a binational, not-for-profit organization which is charged with the authority to construct, acquire, and operate international bridges traversing the Niagara River at or near Niagara Falls, Canada. We operate 3 bridges: the Rainbow Bridge, the Whirlpool Bridge, which is our nexus-only bridge for autos, and the Lewiston-Queenston Bridge, which accommodates both commercial and non-commercial vehicles. In preparing for this testimony, I listened to a previous witness from the first session on border management, and something was said that resonated with me. Laura Dawson from the Future Borders Coalition stated that border security and border efficiency are not mutually exclusive. This is a very powerful statement and should be the backbone of this study. Both are critical to the success of both Canada and the United States and should be viewed concurrently. Border security has received a lot of political attention recently and is critically important for the safety of Canadian citizens. Border efficiency is equally important. It fuels economic growth and trade, streamlines supply chains, enhances the travel experience, reduces environmental impact, and strengthens bilateral relations. The Niagara Falls Bridge Commission's primary goal is to facilitate the movement of people and goods, and CBSA's primary goal centers on security. Though our objectives differ, they are deeply interconnected. It's essential that we partner on both border security and border efficiency. These 2 priorities are not in competition, they're complementary. By working together, we can strengthen security while streamlining the movement of people and goods. There are clear opportunities to improve cross-border efficiency in ways that also enhance security. The hiring of the additional 1,000 CBSA officers is a massive step in the right direction to improve security and efficiency. Staffing has been an issue on both sides of the border for years. We have been fortunate for the last couple of years on the Canadian side to have additional officer trainees from the Gordie Howe Bridge Training Program at our ports in southern Ontario to assist with the peak travel seasons. The Nexus Trusted Traveler Program presents opportunities for improvement that can benefit both border security and efficiency. Continuing to reduce the enrollment processing times, improving program awareness, and modernizing technology could streamline low-risk travel while reinforcing security protocols. Strengthening this program supports our shared goals, facilitating trusted movement and safeguarding the border. CBSA technology upgrades represent a critical area for improvement. The recent IT outage really underscores the vulnerability of the current systems, causing significant disruption to the trucking industry and the hardships for local U.S. border communities. Modernizing infrastructure enhancing system resilience, and improving cross-border data coordination are essential steps towards ensuring both security and efficiency. Acceleration in both procurement and implementation processes are essential to unlock a full potential of CBSA advancement strategy. Any method of obtaining advanced information for CBSA before a vehicle reaches the primary inspection lane can significantly expedite processing and enhance border security. Early access to data allows for risk-based screening, reduces congestion, and supports a more efficient allocation of resources. These improvements benefit both trade flow and enforcement outcomes and should be explored. While we support modernization of the ports and enhanced security as laid out in both Bill C-2 and Bill C-12, we do not support the proposed changes to Section 6 of the Canadian Customs Act that puts the financial burden solely on the owner-operators for any and all infrastructure upgrades, particularly the security enhancement. Section 6 of the Customs Act follows the user pay principle, which is a model emphasizing a more privatized, commercialized, user-funded infrastructure model, which is different than the U.S. and Europe, which rely heavily on centralized government funding. It is important to note 3 points. Number one, every secure crossing point strengthens Canada's overall safety, economic resilience, and international credibility. Border security stretches far beyond the individual user. It's a national responsibility. Number two, the current version of the Customs Act was introduced in 1986, well before the events of 9/11, which fundamentally reshaped border security requirements and infrastructure expectations. When the 1986 version of the Customs Act was released, no one could have possibly had the vision of what was to come. While the owner-operators provide physical infrastructure to support border operations, enhanced border security is a federal mandate with nationwide implications. It protects all Canadians, not just those who are using the crossing.
You have another.
Okay. My third and final is long-term planning is essential to organization. The Bridge Commission maintains a 5-year capital project budget, which is reviewed and approved annually by our board. Given the scale of our capital improvements, we must plan years in advance to responsibly fund projects through operational revenues and toll rate adjustments. We're concerned that the proposed bills, specifically the current language in Section 6, may create conflicts with our long-term planning framework. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Beeger. And we'll be, as you said, there will be questions and comments coming very soon. After we now turn to Mr. Boyle. Mr. Boyle, 5 minutes.
Good morning. Thank you, Honorable Chair Duclos, for the opportunity to be here for you and your committee today. The Peace Bridge is a binational public authority owning and operating the international crossing at Fort Erie, Ontario, and Buffalo, New York. The 10-member board is appointed by the Canadian federal government, the other half by the state of New York. We also own the custom plazas on both sides of the Niagara River. The Canada Border Services Agency and U.S. Customs and Border Protection are our tenants. At an international crossing, there is always an inherent conflict of balancing national security with facilitation and expedited movement of goods and people. At the Peace Bridge, this entails efficiently moving $50 billion in trade annually and supporting a vibrant binational tourism economy. It also means we are required to respond to legislative security requirements imposed by both countries. In 2021, the United States passed the Securing America's Ports Act, which requires the 100% X-ray scanning of vehicles and cargo entering the United States with a target implementation date of mid-2026. At the Peace Bridge, a small and constrained U.S. plaza would make it impossible to meet that scanning mandate, and even if we could, it would result in vehicles having to wait at the primary inspection booths as the scans are adjudicated, leading to lengthy and costly border delays. A much better solution was to put the scanning equipment in our Canadian plaza, thereby allowing U.S. Customs to adjudicate the scan while the truck is moving across the bridge. It simultaneously meets both the security and facilitation goals. Let me explain how. Every truck without stopping moves through a multi-energy portal at a speed of 8 to 14 kilometers per hour. The truck cab is safely scanned at low energy, and then the trailer is scanned at the full energy dose. At the same time, the truck license plate is read, and the e-manifest is verified, allowing U.S. Customs to adjudicate the complete data package during the 2 to 3 minutes it takes for the vehicle to cross the bridge and before the truck arrives at the Customs inspection booth. Locating the facility in our Canadian Plaza takes advantage of the time and space afforded by the bridge, reducing or even eliminating commercial border delays, facilitating Canadian exports, reducing idling and greenhouse gas emissions, assisting truck drivers in meeting their hours of service compliance, freeing up the bridge for tourism and commuter traffic, and also meeting the U.S. government security requirements, including fentanyl and other illegal smuggling-related interdiction. Both the Canadian and U.S. governments agreed with our innovative approach. Canada, through the National Trade Corridor Fund, contributed $5 million, matching the Peace Bridge's $5 million investment for all the civil works, which will house and support the non-intrusive scanning technology. The U.S. government, for their part, is supplying all the scanning equipment at a cost of approximately $30 million US. In December 2024, we completed all the required civil works. We are currently awaiting the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission's permits, which we hope to receive by the end of the year so that the facility may be operational in early 2026. It is an excellent example of the two governments funding and collaborating on enhancing border security. We believe this is a much better and far more efficient solution than the Canadian federal government requiring international crossings to provide outbound inspection facilities as envisioned in Bill C-12, which would be layered on top of existing inbound obligations already unfairly placed on some border operators, including the Peace Bridge. In fact, many of the costs of C-12 implementation will be legislated to be borne by operators like the Peace Bridge through revisions to Section 6 of the Customs Act, which historically has not been administered fairly or equally among all border operators. We understand and appreciate that Bill C-12 is focused on strengthening border security, fighting transnational crime and fentanyl trafficking. In fact, we applaud it. However, without the accompanying fiscal support from the government, border operators, and ultimately the traveling public, will bear the responsibility of cost. I hope my testimony has been informative, and I look forward to responding to any of your questions. Thank you.
It has indeed been informative. Thank you for it, Mr. Boyle, which then allows us to turn to the first MP Davies, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome, Mr. Boyle and Mr. Beeger. It's nice to see you. Mr. Boyle is in my riding. The Peace Bridge is part of the Niagara South constituency. You were both rather polite about your presentation of some of the issues that are facing our two border crossings, but I want to dig in a little deeper into Section 6, Mr. Boyle. The big problem is the double standard of administration. I wonder if you can give me dive a little bit deeper into the Section 6 problems and how, in a comparative way, between the Peace Bridge and perhaps even in Niagara Falls and other bridges, what this means on a financial basis to you and what it could mean for the consumer.
Okay. Thank you very much for your question. As landlords, with the unique perspective of operating on both sides of the border, as such, we can comment on how we interact differently with each government. On the U.S. side of the border, we provide facilities and services to the U.S. government, and the government in turn pays us rent through a lease that we have with the General Services Administration. Also, as a public service corporation, we are also tax-free in the United States, meaning we don't pay property taxes on those facilities that we provide. Conversely, in Canada, we also provide facilities and services to the Canadian government. However, these are provided by us free of charge. Due to Section 6 of the Customs Act. Furthermore, we are required to pay property taxes on those facilities that we provide for free. This disparity can create tensions in a binational organization, like ours, and probably like the Niagara Falls Bridge Commission, as it appears that the U.S. subsidizes Canadian operations. As this committee is likely aware, Section 6 of the Customs Act is meant to be enforced at any international bridge or tunnel that, for the use of which a toll or other charge is payable. To that point, several border crossings operate in direct contravention of Section 6. At the soon-to-be-opened Gordie Howe Bridge in Windsor, Ontario, the Canadian government is paying a public-private partnership concession to build and maintain CBSA facilities. At the Ogdensburg Bridge, another toll facility over the St. Lawrence Seaway, the Canadian government supplies and maintains CBSA facilities. At other bridges, such as the Seaway International Sault Ste. Marie, Blue Water Bridge, and the Thousand Island International Bridge, when revenue shortfalls occur, the Canadian government has subsidized the operations and capital expenses of these bridges to the tune of millions of dollars. Organizations like the Peace Bridge, as well as the Niagara Falls Bridge Commission, cannot avail themselves of such government funding and must instead raise tolls, which impacts our commuters, tourists, and the commerce that crosses our bridges.
Sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Boyle, but let me just clarify this. So, in essence, Section 6 provides an unfair administrative and financial structure because, in your case, when it's not publicly owned, the asset is not publicly owned. The only source of revenue for you is through tolls in the consumer, as opposed to other federally owned bridges, which, by its very extension and nature, would have to have capital contributions to any required expansion under Section 6. So it's possible for Section 6 to impose an obligation on you to spend millions of dollars on possible expansion of assets without a single dollar being contributed to that cost, which would then be passed on to the consumer. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, what is the solution, in your view?
Well, our solution, again, I think Mr. Beeger touched upon it in his opening statement, is that from our perspective, we see two separate models. The U.S. has centralized funding, and so the U.S. government will fund their own security initiatives. The Canadian government, again, based upon the 1986 changes to Section 6, really relies on a user pay funding principle, which back prior to 2004, when I believe CBSA was called Canada Customs and Revenue Agency, it made sense because your primary focus was on the collection of duties and tariffs. 9/11/2001 really changed the scene and the world's focus, and it became more on border security as well as national security. And we feel that the Canadian government's focus at that time should have also then shifted towards funding for those types of initiatives.
I'm sorry, Mr. Beeger. I have to stick with Mr. Boyle on this, but I only have a few seconds left. So the PAIR project, which is the Peace Bridge Pre-Arrival Readiness Evaluation Project, which is that scanning equipment that both you and Mr. Beeger referred to, this is critical stuff, and it's the first time that this technology has been deployed on Canadian soil, I believe. Can you give me some commentary or insight into how you think this technology could be applied in other ports in Canada and what it would mean, for example, on the export of stolen vehicles?
Well, absolutely. So technology, and again, referring back to a previous testimony that you had at one of your other meetings by Dr. Laura Dawson, Future Border Coalition, is technology doesn't necessarily mean the loss of jobs. And security and facilitation also are not mutually exclusive. The PAIR project really, the concern oftentimes when new technology, new regulations, new procedures are introduced is the fear that they will compound or add to either burden or congestion at the bridge. Current inspection procedures actually are only a small percentage of conveyances altogether. And you would think that scanning of 100% of commercial vehicles entering the United States would increase those types of burdens. Sorry. The opposite actually is likely true. you can focus more on targeted targeted inspections at secondary inspections, and also the time that things are taken across the bridge, the time that it takes to cross the bridge, actually allows for quicker adjudication at the primary inspection lanes.
Sorry, Mr. Boyle, that's my fault. I should have pre-warned you that the time was almost up prior to you being able to answer, ce qui m'amène à me tourner vers la députée Dandurand.
So now it's Member Dandurand. You have 6 minutes.
Talking about those scanners. So can you, I know there's been a lot of work that was made with MP Davis' predecessor, MP Battaway. So can you talk a bit about what was the process and what was invested on the front of Canada and where we are at with this scanner technology?
Absolutely. That's a great question. And again, I think it's one to be applauded. With the passage of the Securing American Ports Act in 2021, there was a mandate that 100% of commercial conveyances heading into the United States would be needed to be scanned. There was no possibility whatsoever of us at the Peace Bridge, with a very small plaza in the United States, being able to implement that mandate on our U.S. plaza. The Peace Bridge approached the U.S. government and requested the possibility of this equipment being installed on the Canadian side of the border. We had very good reasons for doing that. One, we didn't have any room on the U.S. side, but also we saw the innovative approach of being able to begin some sort of adjudication process prior to crossing our bridge, which allowed for time and the ability for customs agents remotely to review and scan this equipment. So U.S. CBP actually thought this was a great idea as well. Their model typically is they pay for everything, fully fund all of their security initiatives. We approached U.S. Customs with the idea of investing ourselves so that they could change their model in which they operate by, again, putting it on the Canadian side. And we volunteered to pay for the civil works. When that was done, we actually approached Transport Canada and through their National Trade Corridor Fund, increasing the fluidity of Canada's supply chain. And we realized that the expedited travel, it cut down in greenhouse gases, cut down in idling. It was also able to facilitate truckers to be able to drive quickly and not waste time in queues, and also got Canadian goods out into the U.S. market at a faster rate. We met all those goals of the National Trade Corridor Fund, and to their part, Transport Canada matched our funds of $5 million in order to facilitate the development of the civil works.
From my understanding, there's only one step missing, and it's going to be installed if everything is okay, and it could be installed as early as January or early next year.
Hopefully sometime early in 2026. Right now, the process is going through the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. And again, to their credit, the CNSC has done a great job in focusing on our application and the U.S. government's application. It's interesting because I think one of the reasons why, although we finished last year in December of 2024, why the facility is still not operational is the application process and the regulations in the Canadian government right now really don't cater to this type of application. In fact, the Class 2 nuclear facility application applies to 3 different applications. One is medical, the second is industrial, and the third is for research activities, of which none really cater to scanning of commercial vehicles crossing a bridge. And so we are the proverbial square peg in a round hole. And hopefully we're really the trailblazers in this, because we know that CBSA as well is interested in utilizing this type of technology and hopefully this type of model as well.
Well, I'd like to congratulate you on your resiliency on that and the hard work you did, because it could set an example as well for other borders and make a huge difference, as you were stating in your opening remarks. So it's thank you for doing that and pushing that that very interesting project. I'm from a rural area. We don't have bridge, but I'd like to hear both of you about particular challenges that we face in smaller border crossings regarding security and safety, and how we can improve with the new bills that we're bringing and the new staff we're bringing.
That is an unfair question because they have one more minute for the two of you, but well, there'll be more time afterwards.
Well, again, to be honest, it's very difficult. We operate a bridge, and so for me to opine necessarily on the other aspects between bridges is very difficult. I will say, however, that the cooperation between the United States and Canada has been exemplary. We have 1,000 kilometers of border that is either thin, imaginary line or invisible line, and it's not taken by thousands of kilometers of barbed wire. And so cooperation, I think, between the United States and Canada is tantamount in order to maintain security between both countries.
Mr. Beeger, would you like to take 15 seconds, or we may come back to you in the next round?
I just wanted to mention that all of the borders are different. Every plaza across the border, across the U.S.-Canadian border is different, have different requirements. I did want to mention one of the things, the project at the Peace Bridge is an excellent pilot program, and kudos to the Peace Bridge for pushing this forward. But, this committee is looking for ways to improve things. And, one of the things I want to mention is this has been since 2021. There is the cooperation between CBSA and CBP has improved greatly in the 9 years since I've been in my position. But you can see the holdup as far as whether it's the government interacting with, coming up with ways to get this to move with CBP and CBSA. It's a great project, and it should be moved along faster than it currently is. So, if the committee is looking at ways to improve, there's great communication back and forth, but somebody's got to get in the middle to push these projects through.
Very much, Mr. Beaver. Madame de Bellefeuille pour 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup.
Member de Bellefeuille, you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. I don't know if the receivers are working well for the interpretation. Okay. Well, listen, it's music to my ears to note that we have the same opinion on the fact that the CBSA has to both secure the borders and at the same time enhance the transportation of goods and persons toward the U.S. And as we speak, the purpose of the meeting is how to better ensure the security of the border while at the same time not hampering the trade between the United States and Canada. And we are aware, and we often, while the different locations have good ideas, and we act according to clear thinking, and we respond more quickly than the overall system and the machine that is there to bring in new structures or even to show innovation. Mr. Boyle, today I'm going to ask you, we have a study going and we're looking for recommendations. How can we do better and do more to secure the borders while at the same time both not hampering trade and assisting the transportation of persons and goods exchanged between the two countries? Do you have any specific recommendations that you can formulate to us that we could rely on in order to improve the situation, which, in my opinion, at the moment, needs change and innovation?
Thank you very much for the question. I think one of the recurring themes in my testimony today is that Canada needs to invest in their technology. The U.S. is a trailblazer. The United States Customs and Security is in this type of. the use of drive-through, non-intrusive inspection systems, like the one that I explained, really is setting the standard for 100% of scanning of all vehicles and the finding of all sorts of smuggling and other sorts of nefarious acts. Currently, CBSA uses non-intrusive inspection. However, it is done in a static role, whereas a truck will pull into a location and a mobile, what they call VACUS unit, will actually scan back and forth on the truck. This is very, it accomplishes its goal. However, it's very time consuming, and it takes a lot of queuing and waiting for the truckers. For Canada to improve, they should adopt something along the lines of what the U.S. is now proposing at many of its borders, particularly on the southern border, and for a first here on the northern border at the Peace Bridge. One other area that can be helpful is facial matching. Again, we see this in the airport community, in the airport environment, where time is saved when a passenger can just have their face scanned, and it's matched towards a passport or other form of identification. Doing that at a border can actually also help. And again, this type of technology does not take away jobs. It enhances the ability for CBSA agents to actually do their job more efficiently and be able to focus their attention on those other things that are not just checking a box, but thank you.
Monsieur le Président, vous savez que, bon, le budget est attendu. On sait qu'il y a
Chair, you know that we're waiting for a budget, and we know that new officers or agents will be hired. We don't know how many border agents will be assigned. It's to be determined. We don't know if it's 800 or 1,000, and what will be the role of the new agents or where they will be deployed. But we know that the technology, as you say so well, is not a means of preventing agents from doing their work, but the idea is to investigate in greater depth in order to be able to free up human resources to do their work and to scan the rest of the freight or trucks, as you stated so well in your testimony. What I noted particularly is that you've been innovative, you've proposed a new approach, but the decisions and the process in order to carry through with it and to install the very high-performance X-ray system that will be financed by the United States has run up against some resistance because you're thinking outside the box. And the working tools that will enable greater efficiency and enhance security, it was hard to get it carried through with because the laws and regulations are not there for that. What can you suggest to us to enhance or improve or speed things up when it comes to a good idea that's put forward by a specific location and they want to implement it to enhance the performance and optimize our security?
That's a wonderful question. And again, that's a question for any organization that reaches out and sees innovation. These things take time. We understand that. And certainly, I tip my hat to the people at CNSC because they have been doing their due diligence within the framework that they're given and the application that they're given. They've invested in coming to our facility as well as going to the U.S. southern border to look at this technology. And again, at some point, someone needs to be the trailblazer. And the hope is that this is not a one-off, that this is not just a single occurrence, and that the regulatory agencies that will eventually approve this, hopefully approve this permit, will then change their mindset and change the regulations to become more encompassing to this type of approach. And therefore, again, it takes time. There is a learning curve, and certainly the person that's on the front line of this is always the one that needs to wait the most. But again, CNSC is doing what they need to do, and we hope that they do it as well as they possibly can so that the next applicant that goes through this, namely probably CBSA, will benefit from the work that we've done.
Thank you, Mr. Boyle. Let me turn now to MP Al for 5 minutes.
First of all, thank you for Mr. Boy and Mr. Bigger for your presentation. Now, both of you mentioned that you are trying to upgrade the technology and infrastructure to make our borders more secure, at the same time being efficient. And my question is, now, while we are doing that, I think the criminals are also doing that, right? They are trying to upgrade their technology as well. So are we trying to catch up with, what they are doing? Are we on top of these people? And whether or not there's any gap that you think we have to fill up? So this is a question for both gentlemen.
If you don't mind, I'll answer first, and a very quick answer to you. We're landlords. So security is not our business. It's not in our mission statement. So for me to opine on how to make more effectual the Canadian-U.S. government and security, unfortunately, I can't really offer anything. As I said, we're landlords. We provide a bridge, we provide plazas and booths. So I apologize, but not really in my area of expertise.
Mr. Bigger?
I just want to add a couple of things. It was discussed about thinking outside the box. I think that should be definitely a direction, for this committee. I think there may be things that have been done for a while that need to be looked at. For example, one that we see, and again, maybe not on the top of the list of major issues, but we see a jurisdictional issue. I think, I listened to Mark Weber, the prior witness, who's the union head for CBSA, speak about that he feels that his frontline, officers aren't able to do certain things. We actually also see that, as a port operator. There are situations that, let's say, may be different on the U.S. side versus Canada, where if a issue arises on our bridge, we're directed to call the local law enforcement. So we're actually calling regional police or the RCMP, who there may be a time delay in getting to the border to handle an issue. So, that's something that may have been done for a while, but I did hear the Mark Weber complain about it from his perspective. We just don't understand it ourselves. But that's one, I guess, small area that I would take a look at and say, why is it that we've got CBSA officers who have, guns and are able to, but they don't. They must be being told, or it's part of their mandate, not to confront anyone, or that has to be called to a local law enforcement. So, that's a small issue, but thinking outside the box, I think is something that we all can do. I think all the port operators are willing to get involved in any type of pilot program to assist with any type of infrastructure, or moving things forward faster, and experimenting on things. We have, I'll take our Queenston Plaza for example. We have 8 truck bays, and I asked before this testimony around as to how often are they used, and typically I think the most anybody's ever seen is 4 truck bays being used at one time, and that's extremely unusual. So we have infrastructure, we have facilities, we just need to find a way to use it, and obviously the additional 1,000 officers will help, but more than the 1,000 officers, improving any of the IT work or anything along that side is going to be critical.
And then my question is, so again, in comparison to the south of the border, so how are we doing our job? Are we up to the standard, or are we doing as good as what they are doing in the south of the border? And Mr. Boy, you mentioned 100% scanning of the outgoing cargoes to the United States. Do we have any plan of something similar in Canada? If not, why not?
There are 30 seconds left.
It's interesting, and I'll just answer quickly. right now, the difference between the U.S. southern border and the U.S. northern border, far different as far as that might arise with border security. Canada, CBSA, as I mentioned, has taken part in the review and has been to our site as well as visited the U.S. southern border to review those facilities that I just spoke about. So the intent, I believe, is that they're looking to adopt this in Canada as well, which would be a great stride forward.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Let us turn to MP Assassi for 5 minutes.
Allow me to join my colleagues in thanking our two witnesses. Your testimony has been very, very helpful. Now, if I could start off with Mr. Beaver. In your opening remarks, Mr. Beaver, you did allude to the fact that there were issues for both U.S. border officials and Canadian border officials, I assume. You alluded to that and touched on that issue. I was wondering if you could kindly elaborate on that and perhaps provide us some insights as to what you think those ongoing challenges have been. Okay.
In the last couple of years, because of the additional officers we received from the Gordie Howe training project, the Canadian side has been actually better as far as the number of officers versus the U.S. side. And to kind of give you an idea is we may have, like on the Canadian side, we may have 10 auto lanes, inspection lanes, and 5 commercial truck lanes at Queenston. And you may see 3 or 4 being utilized at a time. There's many times on the U.S. side, there may be only 2 or 3 open at a time when we have, 15 lanes. So again, we have the infrastructure. They're just not being manned on the primary lane. So, this was discussed to one of the prior witnesses at the last session, but getting people at the primary lanes is the critical on both sides to be moving through this. And it may be one of those things that CBSA, again, thinking outside the box, maybe they look at the overall, their business plan, and just a quick suggestion on something like that is, and I'll give you an example with myself, and this wasn't Canadian bound, this was U.S. bound, but I was actually in line and waited 10 minutes for a officer to process somebody only to let them go through. I think it makes more sense to interview somebody at the line for a minute, and if you have a problem, send them to secondary, and maybe you have an expedited secondary that doesn't handle, all the problems. Maybe they don't have to go inside secondary, but maybe it's like a drive-through. You have a couple of people who are experts who can ask questions and determine whether somebody needs to go into the building and be investigated more. So just, little things like that. I think, just something that I think everybody should be thinking outside the box.
Absolutely. For that, and good to hear that on our side, it appears to you we're doing a better job. However, I'm not quite sure I understand what the challenge is. Is it insofar as you are privy to those conversations and can tell, is it a resource allocation issue? Is it a training issue? What do you think it is?
Well, you know what? One of the things I've definitely, again, in the 9 years I've been doing this, that I've seen improvement is quantifying, let's say, the delays and, where we're at. So when I first started in this position, the metrics were extremely rare and weren't being shared. And we're seeing more of metric-based management, let's say, on both sides of the border, where they are watching it. They're looking at what the busy times crossing the borders are, whether there's a Buffalo Bills game or they're not. So there's no question locally they are on top of that and watching it. So, I can't really speak much about the setup CBSA. I know, again, Mark Weber had from CBSA Union had an issue between middle management and line people. All I can say from our side, I can't tell you about their structure and how it works and how efficient it is, but we just need more people in the primary inspection lanes.
Understood. Thank you for that. Mr. Boyle, did you want to add anything to that?
I'll just add quickly, if you don't mind. Typically, we get an answer from CBSA and U.S. Customs that there should be an expectation of delay at the border. This is a border crossing. After all, you're heading into a new country. But I will echo what Mr. Beeger had about the recent years with CBSA staffing. We've been the beneficiaries of the years that it's taken for the Gordie Howe Bridge to come online. And the staffing that CBSA had allocated to the Gordie Howe Bridge, obviously the bridge is not functioning right now, and CBSA Port leadership has been able to benefit from those officers that have been in the training program and waiting to man those booths at the Gordie Howe International Bridge. Our concern is, when that bridge does come online, that those officers will then be sent to their rightful jobs, and local port management will be left with less resources, and we will see again those types of backups that we've had in years past due to low staffing, both on the Canadian side and, of course, on the U.S. side as well. It fluctuates. But again, recent years, we've been very fortunate, but our concern is next year when Gordie Howe does come online, that staffing will be short at the Niagara bridges.
Thank you, sir. MPSRC. We now need to turn to Madame de Bellefeuille pour 2 minutes et demie.
Member de Bellefeuille, 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. This is a question for Mr. Beeger. You talked about an innovative solution that is being put forward by the Border Services Union and also by my political party, in that the border agents have all the necessary training and have the handling of sidearms and everything necessary to be able to intervene within and outside of their posts in order to be able to intercept or manage a situation, an emergency, pending the arrival of the RCMP. And as you said, it's a small suggestion, but it's one way for us, and I believe for border agents, to optimize their presence and to provide enhanced monitoring of the border. Could you state whether you're ready to make a recommendation to the committee that the agency should be able to allow that flexibility for our border agents to work outside of their posts?
I would highly recommend emulating, let's say, the U.S. model as far as allowing the officers to do more than they're currently doing on the Canadian side. I think the having to call the RCMP for issues, we also, our Whirlpool Bridge, we have train tracks on the second level, and occasionally do have people crossing or trying to cross illegally across the train tracks. So to have to call when you have Canadian Customs, CBSA, in a building that may be on the first floor, but looking at the border or securing the border, but not securing the bridge deck above it, and for the fact that we have to call the RCMP and notify them. What we have is, we've probably, between our three bridges, we have about 450 cameras, and we have sensors, and we have a high-tech security system, and so we work with CBSA all the time on this. We work with the local law enforcement, but there seems to be a disconnect, and I think if they were able to do more than what they're currently doing, I think that you wouldn't have to go to 3 different agencies to try and get something resolved.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Beeger.
Monsieur, maintenant.
I would now invite Mr. Member Davies for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a bit of commentary on this, because it's really important that this is on the record. This scanning technology, which is generally referred to as multi-energy, is absolutely critical for scanning containers, commercial vehicles. By deploying this at the first time on Canadian soil, when you dive into this technology, and I'm going to ask you for your opinion on this, Mr. Boyle, because I view that this technology needs to be deployed in every port, every seaport, the Port of Montreal, the Port of Vancouver, in Halifax, every export port in Canada needs to have this technology because it instantaneously can determine, for example, whether there's stolen vehicles in containers that are going into European or export markets. This technology, we've heard, for example, that less than 10% of all the containers in the Port of Montreal are actually inspected. This takes the HR out of it, although it doesn't necessarily affect jobs, but it instantaneously provides 100% accurate data on what's in that container. Mr. Thomas, do you think that would have an enormous impact in other areas and other export ports in Canada?
Absolutely. I mean, certainly it's a game changer in the land border crossing, but it's applicable in ports. It's applicable in airports as well. And I want to say that, again, part of my statement was that this does not take away jobs. What this does is it gives tools to those people. A scan in and of itself is useless unless you have an officer that is reviewing that scan and able to identify anomalies that may occur within a cargo. Aided by things such as artificial intelligence, this really assists in being able to identify things that that look out of the ordinary. And then you can focus your resources on inspecting those areas in which, for example, in a cargo container, you don't have to tear the entire cargo container apart. You can focus on an area that has been identified in a scan, saving time and being much more efficient in what you do.
It would, for example, in the Port of Montreal, every single container that goes through for export can go through this scanner at 10 kilometers per hour on average, with the driver never having to get out of the truck, people at the other end knowing the history of the truck, the name of the driver, the maintenance schedule of the truck, where it's been, what its track record is, knowing whether there's been any issues, for example, any crime related to that company. So this technology could solve our car theft problem in a day.
Car theft, drug smuggling, human trafficking, all sorts of issues can be interdicted. Throw in facial matching for the driver, and you've got really a complete data package to review.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
2 more minutes if you want.
Oh, I do have 2 more minutes?
Well, 1.5.
Okay. Thank you. I'm just going to switch gears a little bit, and both of you, maybe I'll start with Mr. Beeger. Since we've got into some trade issues with the United States, have you noticed significant declines, and do you keep metric analysis of the number of visitors that were coming across the bridge and that perhaps over the summer? Do you have any data that shows that there's a decline in American visitors to Canada?
Right now, we're experiencing, as far as auto traffic goes, we're down about 16% from last year on auto traffic, which it was probably 18 or 20% earlier on in the year, but now we're at about 16% from last year, which was down about 10% from pre-pandemic, is where we're at right now. So our commercial trucks are actually up a little bit this year. We attribute that to the fact that, again, a lot of, with the tariffs, a lot of companies have tried to get some loads across the bridge to avoid any further, unknowns, let's say, with tariffs. But that's where we are with the autos and trucks.
So I'll echo what the speaker had to say. Similarly, bridge, our year-to-year declines in auto traffic has been about 14%. Again, in large part due to rhetoric from Washington, as well as the response boycotts from Canadians. From the U.S. side, we've not seen a huge jump in Americans going to Canada. Again, don't know necessarily the reason why, but in the commercial environment, I'm envious of Mr. Beeger and the Niagara Falls Bridge Commission. We're actually down about 4%. But most of the goods that cross the Peace Bridge are covered under the CUMSA trade agreement, and therefore are unaffected by the tariffs.
Thank you very much. Ce qui m'amène à me tourner vers le député Ramsey pour 5 minutes.
Member Ramsey, now you have 5 minutes.
Alors, donc, j'aimerais vous entendre
So I would like to hear you,
sur
Mr. Bigger and Mr. Boyle, regarding what is the first thing that should be done
la prochaine année ou les 2 prochaines
in the coming year or 2 years in order to improve the operation of your port facilities.
Defer to Mr. Beeger.
You want to start, Mr. Beeger?
Yeah, sure. I'll start. I think the first thing that I would do is, again, I've seen improvement over the years as far as communication between CBP on the U.S. side and CBSA. And there's a lot of talk about the improved communication. I would make sure from the committee's view that this is really being utilized to its extent. The problem at the border is the same problem. And rather than being tackled, the technology and some of the ideas in 2 separate silos, making sure that the groups are working together completely, as far as what they're seeing and what advancements they're making and what technology do they see coming down the road and those type of things. I would make sure that's happening. That would probably be the first thing I would do, because that's more of a global thing that, again, you've got two groups that should be working together rather than two individual. So I think that would be the first thing on my list. Anything, and I know Mr. Boyle has talked about this with his project, which again is an excellent project. But anything we can do, I mean, it's just common sense. Anything we could do to get these officers on the primary inspection lane information before they hit the booths is going to be a win, and that's the way of the future. So any technology, I would help pushing some of this through. Any of the regulations, anything we could do from that side to move things faster on some of these pilot programs.
Alors, juste votre réponse, est-ce que
So to pick up on your answer, are you talking about sharing the same software and the same information, or are you talking about lines of communication?
I guess I would start with the lines of communication, making sure, any shared. I'm not sure if you get to the level of the software. I'm not sure. I'm not privy to what information is passed back and forth right now, to be honest with you. It has, we've seen it from a port side that there has been better communication, but making sure that it's not just lip service, that they are discussing specifics. There doesn't need to be any secrets as to what technology somebody's working on or who gets there first. This is about a joint effort to come up with a solution. And the way I look at it from our port, why don't we use the same technology on both sides? Because there's truly, between the 2 groups, and there's some smart people on both sides, they should come up with the best answer rather than 2 separate technologies or way of doing things on both borders.
Echoing a lot of what Mr. Beeger had to say, certainly data sharing, I believe, exists currently today between CBSA and U.S. Customs. The example of the project that I introduced to you in my testimony, this would be a great example of the U.S. being able to help facilitate export inspections by CBSA, and therefore having some sort of memorandum of understanding or memorandum of agreement that when information is gotten through this export scanning facility, that the Canadian government is also aware of what has passed through the scan. One thing that I might want to also focus on is again, getting back to that recurring thought in my testimony, is that Canada needs to invest in its technology. And Mr. Beeger mentioned earlier about the IT outage that occurred about a month ago that at both the airports and at land border crossings. This type of failure is It's not unprecedented. It's happened before. It happened in 2018 for a single day. This lasted for 3 days, and it created havoc at the border as well as the communities on the U.S. Side of the border. Investing in upgrading of software, upgrading of servers and other IT equipment, I think is tantamount to making sure that the border is going to be managed effectively.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Boyle, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Boyle and Mr. Beeger.
The time, making the efforts to be present virtually or physically. Your input has been much appreciated and will be helpful in drawing the recommendation that we will then be submitting to the government. So thank you again for coming and have a great day.
Thank you.
Of us will suspend for 5 minutes so that we can greet the other guest.
Thank you.
Alors, bonjour à nouveau à tous les membres du
So welcome back, all committee members. We are now ready to move on to the second part of this meeting, and we have the good fortune of receiving
militaire royal du Canada.
Professor Christian Leuprecht of the Royal Military College of Canada. Professor Leuprecht knows how we operate, and we will be able to hear his opening remarks, and we'll have him with us for nearly an hour. So it's a great opportunity for us to have a good discussion with him. So I will begin by turning to you, Professor Leuprecht, for 5 minutes for your presentation.
I've written on
Thank you, Chair.
for almost 2 decades, and I've recently published 2 books on this subject that the committee is studying. I'm also part of the world's largest research network on borders, as part of which I collaborate extensively on Canada-US border issues with key colleagues in the United States. I also direct related research programs on transnational financial and economic crime and maintain relations with key federal, provincial, local, private sector, and civil society stakeholders and entities tasked with national security and border management. Borders are among the most politically contentious issues of the 21st century. Citizens expect their governments to maintain control over their borders, notably who and what enters the country. Canada is among the very few Western countries that has no exit controls on either cargo or people. No wonder that we have an outsized problem with car theft when we don't do outbound inspections on containers in the Port of Montreal. When Canadian marijuana shows up by the hundreds of pounds in Germany and Canadian meth in New Zealand, Canada is creating serious problems for our allies. The European experience suggests a significant portion of citizens who feel their government is losing control over the country's borders is prepared to endorse populist and illiberal measures that are difficult to reconcile with the Constitution and rule of law. A new CBC poll out today reinforces a crumbling consensus on immigration in Canada. This perception is not new. The Safe Third Country Agreement was driven, in large part, by U.S. concerns about Canada being weak on immigration. The state's ability or inability to manage borders effectively is at the crux of safeguarding democratic institutions, political and economic sovereignty in the 21st century.
Monsieur Leuprecht, est-ce que l'interprétation fonctionne bien?
Mr. Leuprecht, is the interpreting working well?
Okay.
The interpreter is working at light speed. Do you want me to slow down? Is it possible just to temper the speed a little, because there's a lot of content in your speech and it's important?
It is in the unique position of sharing a border with the largest economy in the world. Keeping the border with the United States open is economically existential for Canada, but not for the United States. Canada also shares a land border with the largest weapons and drug market in the world. These asymmetries generate criminogenic effects that necessarily precipitate negative spillover effects. In 2024, 88% of the crime guns seized by the Toronto Police Service were traced to the United States. First, our framework for managing borders is not well postured for the challenges of the 21st century. The international refugee system, for instance, was designed for a time when travel was difficult and expensive, travel information hard to come by, and principal threats to citizens presumed to emanate from state actors. Today, travel is cheap and easy, information ubiquitous, and threat vectors emanate primarily from multifaceted, well-financed, non-state actors and naturogenic phenomena such as climate change. Put differently, the ontology of our approach to managing borders is based on territory, while the threat vectors we are trying to contain and disrupt are characterized by transnational mobility: people, money, drugs, illicit trade, terrorism, and the like. CUSMA illustrates Canada's deconnected territoriality. With SEAL trucks from Mexico destined for Canada, Mexico is now effectively part of Canada's land border. Second, the nature of borders is changing. Borders are being pushed outwards, for instance, in the form of pre-clearance, such as enhanced travel authorizations, pre-screening of inbound cargo and people, and inward, think of deportations. Moreover, much of money laundering, fraud, and radicalization happens in cyberspace, which has no borders. People think of the border as a line, but the threat vectors are near impossible to manage effectively at the line. They need to be managed well before they ever reach that border. That requires extensive cooperation, coordination, such as ShipRider, which the U.S. is now on record as wanting to extend to the land and air domains, and collaboration. Third, for over 85 years, Canada and the United States have had a shared border strategy to have one another's back. After the attacks of 9/11, then Prime Minister Chrétien's approach to keeping the border open consisted of reassuring the United States that Canada had America's back. Canada adjusted its national security laws and posture within weeks and months. Chrétien understood intuitively that to keep the border open, it had to be well managed. Both the Biden and Trump administrations, Congress, the U.S. Northern Border Caucus have repeatedly made it clear that, rightly or wrongly, Canada is no longer living up to its end of the bargain. Specifically, they are concerned that Canada has become a high-value, low-risk backdoor to the United States, whose proliferating legislative and structural weaknesses are being exploited by powerful and dedicated state and non-state actors to undermine the social fabric, economic prosperity,
30 more seconds,
and territorial
Mr.
integrity
Record.
of the United States. I'll leave it at that.
Sorry, we had
Je vais m'arrêter là. Désolé, nous avons dû vous interrompre.
to come back to some of the points you would have liked to raise, and we'll now turn to MP Kirkland for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Through you, thank you, Professor. I appreciate your speedy first testimony. I understand it's a lot of information to get in a very short time. You said so many interesting things, and I've also previously paid attention to some of your interviews. So I have a few questions regarding that, and as well as your testimony here today. You said at one of them that Canada had 4 years to secure the border, and there was failure to act, and it seemed to be that was for political reasons. So that's the first sort of part of my question, the political reasons, why you think we failed to act and what those political reasons were. And the second part is, would you say that our failure to strengthen its borders against organized crime, illegal migration, has damaged our credibility with the United States at this time?
My colleague Kim Nossel published a book in 2023 called Canada Alone, and where he cautions that the trajectory that Canada is on, it is quickly losing the trust and confidence of its closest allies and partners, and that is detrimental to Canadian economic and political sovereignty if Canada stays the path. His point was simple, that the challenges from the second Trump administration could have been anticipated. And in the book, he actually lays out everything the Trump administration has been doing in its first few months. And that in Canada, we opted to take the interlude of 4 years to pretend that Trump 1 was an aberration rather than the new normal, the structural new normal in the relationship, and to prepare effectively for that structural new normal. Now, I empathize with politicians because politicians respond to public demand. And when there's no obvious public demand to respond, then they are unlikely to act. And there wasn't much of a public demand other than a few geeks like me talking about it. But we need to understand that not acting on the border has real harms for real people. We have a large active human smuggling industry. We have a large illicit trade industry that is bringing vast amounts, for instance, of illicit tobacco in this country that is ultimately being sold in ways that undermines public health and undermines Canada's tax revenue. I gave you some examples with regards to proliferation of drugs. We know that one of the two global financial institutions in this country has been subject to criminal conspiracy charges to which it pled guilty in the United States, and the United States having imposed market capitalization restrictions on that bank. As a result, this significantly impedes Canada's ability to compete in global financial markets when one of its two global financial institutions has these caps imposed. And you can imagine, if you look at the frustration of the then Biden administration Attorney General in announcing the indictment against that bank, when we have a Canadian bank that is actively being accused and subsequently pleads guilty to effectively conspiring in fentanyl trafficking to undermine the U.S. social fabric, and you are wondering why we might have a trust, confidence, and reputation problem with the United States, and as I pointed out, increasingly with our closest allies.
Thank you for that. And I appreciate you bringing, sir, the human component into what you said. I haven't talked about this yet in my role as a member of Parliament because I get emotional about it. So I'll carefully, just before I ask about breakdown points, during the last federal election, I lost my brother's son, my nephew, to an accidental overdose, and fentanyl is the reason for that. And I'm going to talk a lot more about that when I can do it, not emotionally, but I appreciate so much that you brought that human aspect to it. So my background is in educational therapy. Sometimes we get accused of looking at the negative, right? You're always looking at the negative, you know, why are students having struggles? Why are they struggling? But to look at the negative, sometimes you have to look at those breakdown points to figure out how to solve the problem that we have. So a couple questions on that. We've heard repeatedly that fentanyl and precursor chemicals are flowing through Canada ports, right, across the border. Where specifically are the biggest breakdown points that you see in detection and enforcement? Just your top two maybe breakdown points, just for the sake of time. And also, where has federal coordination been between public safety, CBSA, and the RCMP broken down? Where do you see that breakdown is between them, and what structural reforms could you maybe suggest to address those gaps?
In about 30 seconds.
Oh, I'm sorry, that's a lot for 30 seconds. Yeah.
What frustrates me is that we take apart super labs by the dozens in this country, and in many cases, not a single person gets charged. Our inability to go after the kingpins of transnational organized crime in this country shows that we are not postured and we are not structured to actually engage with these transnational threat vectors. And simply adding a few people here and there or tinkering with a little bit of legislation will not fix the problem if we are not going to commit politically to restructuring the national security posture. Our allies in the United States, Australia, the United Kingdom, several European allies have done it. We have not. On coordination, I would actually say we actually now have pretty good federal coordination. Where we lack significantly in coordination is with our provincial, local, private sector, and civil society stakeholders. And that is a whole testimony on its
I'm sorry to interrupt. We'll have certainly an opportunity to turn back to the witness.
Such a in-depth question. Would you mind providing to the committee something in writing, a little more in-depth on that after? Thank you.
Thank you, MP Kirkland. Let me turn now to MP Akan for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for being us today, Mr. Lupprecht. So my question to you is, our government has announced recent investments to hire 1,000 RCMP and 1,000 CBSA officers. As mentioned earlier in this committee, Canada's border plan aims to bolster security operations across the border from infrastructure, technology, and intelligence sharing. These are first steps to strengthen our border and bolster our enforcement capabilities across the frontier. From your expertise and your just recent answer, what additional investments should the government pursue to strengthen our capabilities on the borders?
Merci de cette question importante, sir.
Thank you for this important question.
The overall problem. The way the organization functions and its inability to perform on some of the most highest political priorities for the federal government suggests that we need serious structural reform when it comes to national and federal policing in this country. And the previous prime minister, after having been in office for almost a decade, in the dying days of his office, went on record in his white paper on this. This should give us serious pause for thought, and it is a serious cause for frustration among our allies. I would also say, in light of what I told you, hiring more CBSA officers is not going to fix our problem, or more RCMP officers. In my view, all those CBSA officers should not go on the front line. They should all be doing intelligence and investigative work, because borders is a very complex issue of expertise. And where we are falling down is our ability to actually run complex, where we are under-resourced, is on what keeps the threats away from our border to begin with, and our ability to collaborate with our allies. On intelligence sharing, yes, we have a growing number of liaison officers with key institutions in both the United States and in other countries. It is unfortunate, in my view, that it looks like Canada recently did that in response to U.S. demands. These are proposals that have been put out well before, but unfortunately, in some cases, had not been actioned. But what value are those liaison officers actually providing? Where is the study and the evidence? As far as I can tell, there's considerable frustration, at least among some U.S. agencies, that say it is so cumbersome to work with Canadian colleagues, that the requirements, the regulations, the policies are so overwhelming that we might as well not even bother, because what takes us a matter of half an hour in the United States takes half a day or a day just to do the paperwork. And I understand the importance of following proper regulations and proper procedure. But there is a fine balance between government assuming certain degrees of political, financial, and reputational risk, and offloading all the risk onto the agencies with the policies, procedures, regulations, which means that we then can't have those people doing the investigative and intelligence work we want them to do, because they spend all their time managing risk for the government.
Thank you, Mr. Lupprecht. And I'm assuming that your expertise is on the table and you are putting all these recommendations to the government agencies and the government personnel?
I am happy to work with you to formulate whatever submissions or further recommendations the committee might be looking for. My remarks, in particular with regards to the RCMP, have been on the record in what I think is the longest study that's out there currently on the RCMP not being commissioned by government, which lists every, I think, of 70 different studies that had been done over the years on the RCMP. I don't know the number exactly. I'd need to go back and look. But the point being is that we've been at this for decades, and we keep kicking the can down the road, and we think we're going to fix the problems by hiring a new commissioner.
Thank you. So follow-up. Are there other models of border security and enforcement among Canadian allies and partners like the Five Eyes, from which lessons can be learned for the U.S.-Canada border? And how does the management of the Canada-United States border differ from in any other countries?
In 1 minute.
My first starting point is that I think whether it comes to policing in this country, whether it comes to borders, we actually need a systematic professional development program. Right? So one of the things the military does, it has a systematic program to develop officers in particular and rank and file members and NCOs as they rise through the ranks. We lack that at the level of policing. CBSA does it a little bit better in the way they go about this, which means we never harness the full capacity of the people that we have, in particular at the officer and at the management levels. This is a very small investment with very high returns, because the most important thing aren't memoranda of understanding or technology or so forth. It is the people that we have and investing in those people so we get the maximum return from the area of expertise. We also need, I think, a dedicated, I've long been on record, we need one dedicated agency in Canada, expert agency to deal with the border. Canada is very different in the way that it has two agencies, one expert agency to manage at ports of entry and a generalist agency that manages not just borders, but whose commissioner has the largest span of control of any democratic police force in the world. And we wonder why we are struggling with this organization because we're asking too much of it on too broad a spectrum. I can provide some submissions on on other models, but I think it ultimately comes down to political will, and it comes down to understanding that security is job one for government. And as long as we don't understand that this is the first mover.
Thank you, Mr. Loiprecht. Sorry to interrupt again. Ce qui m'amène à me tourner vers la députée de Bellefeuille pour 6 minutes.
Member Bellefeuille for 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair.
Professeur, d'être présent avec nous.
Thank you, Professor, for being here with us today.
Votre analyse qui sort un peu.
It's great to hear your analysis, which is outside of what we've normally heard so far in our study. The agency stated with that there would be 1,000 more border officers and 1,000 more RCMP officers. They said that with a lot of pomposity, but what we would like to do when we manage the agency and the RCMP, when they receive media attention or political attention, then they send resources there, whether it's car theft or the borders. But what sectors are we leaving out? We're leaving out investigation and intelligence because we have limited human resources that do not necessarily correspond to the current threats and the needs in that regard. And you're seeing that we ought perhaps to have a more pragmatic analysis of our resources and their use to optimize the skills of the RCMP and border officers to be able to deploy them as needed and do a more localized analysis of the needs for each entry port rather than managing them in a general way. You're proposing a more personalized or custom managed approach, if I understood well.
Madame, 3 points.
An excellent analysis, ma'am. First of all, on the resources, the RCMP has an organization which is, there are considerable restrictions, and they realign the resources based on political priorities, which explains why we can rarely develop the necessary expertise, because from day to day, we expect that priority will be placed here or over there. So instead of having a systematic strategy, if we leave the border and the entry points in the hands of the RCMP, then you need a specialized team permanently that focuses on, for example, the borders. The second point, in this country, we lack the capacity for,
assessment.
Of strategic intelligence assessment. We need a strategic overall approach, or we need to allocate our resources to strategic priorities in order to achieve objectives and strategic goals. And I would say that there are two priorities. First of all, there are national security priorities, and the other group would be priorities that are,
Ms. Kirkland, that are causing the most individual harm. But
without a good overall view, we cannot really allocate our resources strategically to achieve strategic goals. Thank you, Chair. We know that the National Federation of Police find it difficult because the government changes its priorities too often and allocates its resources, for example, against organized crime, and then there's a change of government, or a new minister comes in and the priorities change, and then, as you stated, it's no longer possible to develop expertise and to continue the work that's begun. There are a lot of different projects that have opened up, but the police officers and border officers are shifted from one priority to the next. And I think this has to be said. The higher levels of the agency and RCMP do not necessarily be listening to their grassroots, but they tend more to listen to the politicians who want to make political points, but are less concerned about the short and long-term strategic approaches. As public policy is done the other way around in this country. There's a lot of policies, and then it's considered that it's going to give a greater amount of achievement of objectives. But what we don't have is a national security strategy. The latest one dates back to 2004 to really target the other policies that we shape in this country. Another point that you rightly raised is that there's a localized aspect to all of this. And
depuis septembre 2001,
since September 2001, there has been a centralization of the management of border security, or the border issues are either very localized. For example, in Quebec, everything is connected to protecting language and culture, including the way in which cross-border flows are managed. So in other words, it involves having a policy that is more sensitive to the history, to the flows, and to the needs of local communities across the border, including economic flows. Do I still have time, Chair? Go. So I would also say a recommendation.
La GRC et l'agence.
The RCMP and the BSA should be more connected to local officials, where there's an entry way for training, for increasing knowledge, and in order to bring in their collaboration in gathering data and their observations. I feel opening on the part of the RCMP, but not necessarily on the part of the CBSA. What do you think?
À mon avis, difficile.
In my opinion, it's certainly difficult to manage public safety issues with an agency whose structure and policies are serving Ottawa's objectives and reflect Ottawa's goals, whereas the local areas in rural Quebec, for example, so it's the structure of the RCMP does not lend itself well to the objectives and goals that we expect on the part of the RCMP. Without a real restructuring, will continue with the police and policing associations and politicians, and the public at large must be frustrated with the results that we're asking this agency to do, because it's not structured to respond to those kinds of needs, as we know. Thank you very much for those comments, which brings us to MP Gill, please.
We really appreciate it. I know you touched on somewhat for the U.S. government and the Trump Association, Trump administration coming forward and basically saying that how the immigration policies and the increased border control that they demanded. Why do you believe that the Liberal government failed to take early and obvious steps to strengthening our border security and provide necessary resources before illegal crossing, smuggling, and organized crime activity surged in Canada?
I will read you a paragraph that I skipped, but I think that responds strategically to your question, which is that my late Queen's colleague, Niels Orvik, cautioned that as the smaller partner in the continental sovereignty dilemma, Canada's strategy in dealing with the United States must be to defend against help, to preempt unsolicited offers of help, which means for Canada to establish and maintain credibility in matters of security and defense with its great neighbor, as a way to safeguard Canada's capacity for sovereign decision-making. Because, of course, once the United States comes in and helps us, we've now seriously constrained our ability to make the decisions that are in the best interest of Canadian citizens and the legitimately elected government, as reflected by the legitimately reflected government of this country. A more aggressive, robust, bilateral, bipartisan approach to managing border security is essential to counter the bipartisan consensus in the United States that Canada is a liability to the United States by virtue of actual and perceived deficits on security and defense.
Thank you for that. I want to make sure that we can keep concise answers as we go forward. But in your view, how is this avoidable to avoid situations like this?
For a decade, myself and former lead on CBP under the Obama administration, Alan Burson, have had a proposal for what we call NORAD 2.0, which is effectively for the two countries to agree to depoliticize how we manage the border and to give the border, including the intelligence, enforcement, investigative infrastructure that goes along with it, to professionals to manage. And I think we have an opportunity. The silver lining of the challenges that we currently have with our southern neighbor is precisely that we can propose new structures that might better serve both our interests. And I think taking the politics out of it and leaving it to professionals has served us very well in terms of continental defense. And I think we might do very well to do likewise at the border.
Understood. Thank you for that. But for today, what are the consequences of the failures today and how do they affect us, not just for our national security, but for our community safety, for agency morale, and for public trust?
The challenge is we now have a very significant lag effect. And the temptation, I think, by politicians has been, this is a very complex space that has many moving parts, and it is very dynamic. And so my sense is, and you tell me if I'm wrong, that politicians look at this and go, this is going to be really hard and really high risk, so let's just try to kind of put Band-Aids on it, keep the wheels on the wagon, hope it doesn't fall apart, and leave it for someone else to fix, and we'll just kick the can down the road. The problem is the delta between where we need to be and the challenges that we have as a result of transnational state and non-state actor threats and expectations by the United States and allies continues to grow exponentially. And so what is the strategy for narrowing that delta, both operationally and especially in terms of perception by our closest partners?
I believe you're correct. I believe that the current government is not taking these precautions seriously, and like you said, is implementing a technique of putting Band-Aids on it as for now. As we see these promises from the Liberal government that are unfulfilled, and there's no real urgency for any quick solutions and what's broken at our borders, is this government still failing to take these issues serious today?
20 seconds left.
The current Prime Minister's attention to working with what I call joint multifunctional teams that get us out of departmental silos and get the right experts around to solve targeted problems with very clear expectations and clear milestones that reflect both scale and pace, mass and quality, is a good way to reframe the problem. Now it is for the government to demonstrate that it can actually deliver.
Thank you, Mr. Leuprecht. Well, let me turn to Madame Dandurand pour 5 minutes.
Member Dandurand, you have 5 minutes.
Very interesting to hear you. And I've heard my conservative colleagues talking a lot and making you talk about public trust and reputation risk and things like that. Very recently, the conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, was talking about RCMP leadership, saying things such as they're despicable. So from the perspective of national security in a domestic matter and in a perspective of the role of institutions such as RCMP, what are the consequences of a perceived loss of institutional legitimacy? Could this affect cooperation between within Canada or with our partners when we have leaders talking in such a way of our leadership?
I think in many ways, the RCMP leadership finds itself in an impossible situation in terms of the expectations we've placed on it. Is perhaps that, as I mentioned, we could do much more in terms of preparing our national security leaders more effectively for the challenges and the tasks that we give them. And I think we always need to trust that every civil servant in this country, including myself as a professor at the Royal Military College, spends every day doing their very best at trying to serve the interests of this country, of the government of the day, of their institutions and of their people. But we might ask hard questions why perhaps some of the perhaps not as prudently expressed criticisms as we could reflect perhaps not just frustrations by a leader of the opposition, but also frustrations by some of the police associations, by some of the members who work, by some of the provinces and local police forces and governments, as well as by some of our allies and partners, and what it is incumbent upon us as the political authority to provide in terms of the direction, the resources, the structure, and the capabilities to ensure we set people up for success with the tasks that we expect of them in these very complex and challenging times.
Thank you. Recently, in front of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development, you were talking about Canada's Arctic strategy, and you were talking about defense and as an investment to innovation in research technology. You were talking about the European drone company Helsing and the power of the algorithm behind those drones. So can you elaborate on the high-tech skills we have in Canada and how they can be utilized you get it, to support efforts along the U.S. border?
So the investment point is so important. You might know that I have a separate life in police governance, where I've tried very hard, and I think we are getting there, of changing the discourse around money we put into local policing as an investment. What is the return on that investment? How is the political authority defining what we expect in terms of clear strategic plans and clear measurable metrics, as opposed to just saying, here's more money, go do a little bit different or more of the same? Can we make sure that we actually treat the money that we provide? Politicians talk about investments, but where's the public accountability for those investments and the objectives that we actually want to achieve with those investments, and holding the leadership of institutions accountable for the public money that we actually invest in terms of delivering on the expectations of the government of the day? In terms of high tech, look, this environment is changing very quickly. And I think the Prime Minister during the election talked about procurements. He's now talking about investments. I think this is reflects in part a recognition that we can't actually procure much of what we are looking for because either it doesn't exist in the shelves or because we are not set up to procure it. The point that I make is if you want to sell drones in this country, as an innovative company, you could not, because what do? We procure drones that achieve certain effects. Well, the algorithm and the AI is evolving much faster than the actual drones and the effects we need to achieve with those drones. So what we need to procure is actually the algorithm and the AI, and then build the drone on top of that to achieve those effects. So what are we going to do to make sure the government becomes a data-driven organization?
Thank you, Professor Leiprecht. Sorry to interrupt you. I know it's always with great regret that I do so, but that's my job. Member de Bellefeuille, 2 minutes for you, 2.5 minutes. Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I wonder about accountability and responsibility of the Public Safety Minister. Often the minister will place aside the responsibility by saying that the CBSA is an independent agency and I cannot tell them what to do or how to do things. And to my mind, this is a way of pulling away from responsibility and accountability. And I would like to hear you on the fact that, well, how can we increase or enhance that accountability of a minister who is supposed to ensure border security and national security, but who seems to put aside that responsibility by handing it over to an independent agency?
Tout d'abord, la responsabilité.
First of all, in my opinion, the responsibility of any minister is to establish
peut-être 5 priorités,
3 or 4, perhaps 5 top priorities for his or her department to make sure that all the public officials know what the goal is, not 12 or 30 priorities, 3, 4, or 5 of them. And I would say what the minister expects from the senior officials and allocate resources and allocate staff and financial resources to those priorities. Secondly, I think there is a greater capacity for ministers to give very clear guidelines in relation to the expectations of the department. But thirdly, in my opinion, the federal public service is not structured to deliver based on the public policy priorities of the current government. So would you agree that we could appoint a border minister whose sole responsibility would be to ensure the management of the borders and to be responsible and accountable for that? I'm not convinced that we need more ministers. On the contrary, there are larger countries such as Germany that manage things with a very small number of ministers in the cabinet. But it reflects, as you say, a certain political responsibility, including ministerial responsibility for our departments. And we know very well, based on public studies, that there's been a rapid decline of the responsibility of a minister in the ministerial responsibility in the framework of our parliamentary Westminster-based parliamentary system. So I think there's an opportunity for the Prime Minister to reestablish the purpose. Thank you, Professor Leiprecht. I'm sorry once again, which brings me to turn to MP Lloyd for 5 minutes, please.
For being here, Dr. Luprecht. Seeing as you're a professor, I might ask you a bit of a philosophical question and maybe challenge you on one of the things I think you said was talking about depoliticizing the border. In my experience in this place as a member of parliament, a lot of times government doesn't take action unless you make an issue political. I think of the issue of auto thefts in this country that had been rising for a couple of years significantly before it became a political issue. And then the government started taking action on it. I think of when we talk about the flaws in the bail system, for example, and when opposition parties hold the government accountable and make these into political issues, it leads to action. So I'm wondering if you can tell us briefly how you propose depoliticizing something like the border and ensuring that we get effective management at the same time.
Terrific points. So, yes, I think for politicians to take action, there's sort of 3 basic preconditions. First, there needs to be a recognition that there's genuine physical harm to citizens as a result of non-action. That there needs to be a sense of that the diminishing that harm for the greatest number of Canadians. And then there needs to be a sense, I think, by politicians that there's a chance of actual success with what is being put forward. You tell me if you think that I'm wrong on that. And so, yes, we need political action because only politicians have the authority to change the frameworks under which civil servants operate, in terms of the priorities we set, in terms of the legislative constraints that we ultimately set. So, yes, it is on the political authority to establish that. But we established NORAD under an environment of a rapidly changing threat environment at the time that posed continues to pose existential threats to this continent. I think we need to understand that what is happening on our borders is a rapidly changing threat and security environment that poses an existential threat to the political and economic sovereignty of this country if we don't get it right. And so here's the opportunity to rethink how we manage the Canada-US border, because that, if we can't manage it effectively, I think that will ultimately be the end of this country.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to another line of questioning. We heard at the last committee meeting, we had journalist Sam Cooper come in, and we heard about how the non-resident import program. Are you familiar with the non-resident import program? Can you tell us, do you believe that the non-resident import program is being used to bring precursor chemicals into Canada?
I think there are a vast number of vulnerabilities And I think the political priorities on immigration in recent years have rapidly outpaced the ability of our intelligence and security agencies to do the vetting and be able to build the investigative and intelligence capacity to ensure that these are not being systematically exploited at scale by bad actors.
Now, do you think, Dr. Leuprecht, that public safety was the #1 priority when the government made a number of these immigration-related policies, or were there other priorities that superseded public safety? I think, for example, in 2016, when visas were lifted on Mexico, for example, against the recommendations of many in the public safety sphere, that it would lead to an increase. And now we see in 2024 the government's reimposed those visas after seeing the detrimental impact of that. Do you think this government has always put public safety as their #1 priority when putting forward their policies?
We live in a democracy, and it's the prerogative of the government of today to pick its to pick its priorities, and that might or might not involve aligning with the advice from the civil service of the day. But I mean, there is a reason why we have civil service experts on these areas, and certainly, and as you heard from my previous answer, there's an opportunity to strike
in your experience as an academic who follows this, following the policies of this government over the past 10 years, do you think that public safety has been a priority in this sphere, or do you think that other priorities like increasing immigration or increasing bilateral relations with other countries have taken precedence over Canada's public safety?
I think there's not been an incentive to make public safety the ultimate priority. Because there wasn't a demand from, I think, the electorate to that effect. There was simply a demand from expert agencies and from allies. But look, many of these were not, I think, sins of commission, but sins of omission. And so now we are atoning for the aggregate effect of these multiple sins of omission.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Turning now to vers le député Ramsey pour 5 minutes.
Member Ramsey, you have 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Professor Leuprecht, for your presentation. That was very well delivered, but as we know at the House of Commons, it's not because you delivered so convincingly that it's always true. So I'd like to bring back a few statements you made. First of all, I can tell you that out of 1,000 staff members that the Border Services Agency hired, 200 are already reserved for what you referred to, which is second line services, which could indeed assist in terms of intelligence and investigation so that the front line officials can be better served. In Canada, and perhaps I'm improvising a little, but you use the word burdensome or cumbersome when other countries call on us for our services. Isn't it a little simplistic or condescending to say things that way? Because I would remind you that in a previous life when I worked and I was calling upon services from other countries where it was clearly burdensome and cumbersome, and perhaps even our neighbors to the south a bit more than elsewhere. Is that not inherent when dealing with different cultures, that it's a little bit more difficult to work together? And that does that mean that in Canada, nevertheless, that we're efficient because someone in the U.S. decided that it's a bit more complicated working with us than with, let's say, their neighbor in Dale County next door? I'm not so sure about that, really. And the third point I'd like to raise is that you also said that the Royal Canadian Mounted Police is too big to fulfill its mandate. Since we've had this committee sitting, we've been hearing people talk about the need to communicate and to collaborate. And if the RCMP if that federal police didn't exist in its current form, if the responsibilities were spread around to different agencies, wouldn't there be a risk then precisely that collaboration that is essential would not exist or would be disrupted? I think that in contrast, I think we need a strong federal police force and having a command that has an overall vision that enables us to provide security. So I'd like to hear you on that.
Des très bonnes observations et certainement.
Very good observations, and certainly some of the actions of our partner to the south of the border make the situation difficult for our intelligence officers because we don't want to end up in a situation where we're sharing intelligence that might be used beyond the rule of law, whether in the Canada or the US. And we're certainly a sovereign country, so we don't always have to answer the expectations of our partners in the US or elsewhere. But from my experience, we nevertheless have transactional costs that are very high in this country when it comes to national security issues and intelligence. And we have found in other countries, there are more efficient and effective measures. As regards the RCMP, for a long time, I defended a model where the RCMP is withdrawing from provincial contracts. There are limits to that. In the Atlantic, in Newfoundland, and in the territories, there should always be involvement by the federal government because they're unable to cover the cost of their policing services. But I believe that we need an agency dedicated to policing, but we also need a criminal intelligence agency at the federal level. In Australia, they divided the responsibilities of investigation and for policing and the responsibility of criminal intelligence. And I think that as long as we don't have a separate federal policing agency, one for criminal investigation and one for criminal intelligence, with two separate agencies, until we get that, it'll be very difficult to achieve the objectives we have in terms of national security priorities of the federal government. Ms. Ramsey, you have 30 seconds. May I file a motion if that's all the time I have left? It depends whether it's a motion or a notice of motion. It's a notice of motion. So I would like to present this notice, which reads as follows. Given the dangerous and disconnected remarks by Pierre Poilievre, leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, concerning the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, in an interview that he did with Northern Perspectives, including accusations of cover-ups of scandals, we reaffirm our confidence in the independence of the RCMP and the work it has accomplished for Canadians, and ask Pierre Poilievre to apologize and to withdraw those comments. Since this is a notice of motion, there is no debate, and it also brings to an end the time allocated to you, Member Ramsey and Professor Leprecht. I'm afraid that's all the time that we had, but fortunately, I still have a few moments left to thank you for being here, for taking the time and all the work that you've put into preparing for this participation before the committee. Thank you very much. Your comments and your suggestions will certainly be very helpful for what is to follow. Thank you, Chair.
Et ça nous permet d'adjourner.
So this brings the meeting to an end until the next meeting.